What if the greatest minds of ancient Greece weren't just brilliant? What if they had help? Dr. Elara Vance thought she was restoring a 2,000-year-old calculator. Instead, she discovered something impossible. A machine that tracks celestial bodies that shouldn't exist, predicting eclipses that never happened in our solar system. The Antikythera Mechanism wasn't built for our world. It was built for another one entirely. And according to its calculations, that other world is coming back. The room was a paradox, a place where the 21st century had invaded the 2nd century BC without firing a shot. Ancient limestone walls, part of the university's oldest foundation, rose to a vaulted ceiling that had looked down on generations of scholars. But within these hallowed confines, a sterile, modular laboratory hummed with the quiet confidence of modern science. At its heart, bathed in the clean white light of overhead LEDs, sat a machine that was both intruder and supplicant. A state-of-the-art, multi-axis computed tomography scanner. And inside its polished metallic ring, resting on a velvet cushion, lay a lump of corroded bronze that looked like it had been dredged from the bottom of a nightmare. This was the Antikythera Mechanism, or what was left of it. Dr. Elara Vance moved around the scanner with the economical grace of a shark, her focus absolute. At 40, her dark hair was already streaked with silver, pulled back so tightly it seemed to accentuate the sharp, intelligent lines of her face. She was a marine archaeologist by trade, a physicist by training, and a pragmatist by religion. Her world was one of measurable data, of physical evidence that could be tested, verified, and catalogued. Her gloved fingers danced across a holographic interface, tweaking tolerances, adjusting resolutions to the micron level. This was the final calibration. After 6 years of painstaking restoration, of cleaning away 2 millennia of oceanic crust, this was the moment of truth. Standing by the archive's lead-lined window, silhouetted against the night, was Dr. Julian Croft, in his 50s, with a tweed jacket that had seen better decades and a cascade of untamable white hair. He was Elara's academic opposite. A historian of science, Julian lived in a world of ideas, of towering intellects and flashes of genius that changed the course of civilization. He saw the mechanism not as a data set to be processed, but as a sacred text to be read. He stared at the formless lump in the scanner, his voice soft with reverence. Numberless are the world's wonders, but none more wonderful than man. He sighed, a dramatic, heartfelt sound. Sophocles. Even he could never have imagined this. Without looking up from her console, Elara replied, her tone flat and precise. The more accurate translation of Deinos in that context isn't wonderful, it's terrible or strange. The line is about humanity's terrifying and unnatural power over the world. She made a final adjustment. Let's stick to the data, Julian. The poetry can wait until after we publish. Julian just smiled faintly. The correction didn't bother him. It was just Elara being Elara. For years, their two opposing worldviews had ground against each other, and in the process, had polished this project to a brilliant shine. With a final tap on the screen, Elara initiated the scan. A low hum filled the room, and a thin, blue beam of light began to dissect the artifact, layer by digital layer. The scan took 3 hours. 3 hours of charged silence, broken only by the hum of the scanner and the quiet clicking of Elara's keyboard as she monitored the data stream. When it was finished, the silence deepened, becoming heavy with anticipation. Elara drew a steadying breath and activated the main holographic display. In the center of the room, a cloud of light coalesced. It shimmered, then resolved into a perfect, 3-dimensional ghost. Floating in the air between them was the Antikythera Mechanism, as no human eye had seen it in over 2,000 years. Every one of its 82 fragments was present, digitally stitched together. But more than that, the AI had peeled away the layers of corrosion and decay, reconstructing the intricate web of gears and dials that lay within. It was a phantom of bronze and genius, a clockwork of breathtaking complexity. The air was still, but the image seemed to hum with locked potential. Julian took a half step forward, his hand unconsciously reaching out as if to touch the impossible object. "They built this," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "With hands and fire, with no tool more complex than a compass and a ruler." Elara's eyes were fixed on the diagnostic readings scrolling down a side monitor. She was all business, but her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of her console. "Initial reconstruction is within tolerance," she announced, her voice tight. "The AI has interpolated the missing gear teeth based on wear patterns and proto-Hellenistic gear ratios. All known fragments are integrated, structural integrity confirmed." She looked at Julian, a flicker of something triumph, perhaps in her gaze. "Ready to see if it works?" Julian could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Elara turned back to the console and typed a single command. "Run simulation. Origin date, 128 BC. The ghost in the room came to life. With a silent, fluid grace, the holographic gears began to turn. Tiny spindles spun, larger wheels engaged, and interlocking dials rotated in perfect counterintuitive harmony. In the center of the display, a golden orb representing the sun ignited. A smaller silver one, the moon began its dance. Its motion slightly, beautifully irregular, perfectly simulating its elliptical orbit. One by one, the 5 planets known to the ancient world appeared as points of colored light. Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and fell into their own complex interlocking paths. It was a miniature cosmos, a clockwork universe born from the mind of a forgotten genius. "Incredible," Julian breathed. "It's a perfect Ptolemaic model, but centuries before Ptolemy." "Fast forwarding," Elara said, her fingers flying. The celestial dance accelerated. Days, months, and years flew by in a silent blur of light. Target date, May 28th, 585 BC. The simulation raced backward through time, the gears spinning at an impossible speed. Finally, it slowed and settled on the target date. The model held steady, and there, plain as day, the silver orb of the moon slid directly in front of the golden sun, its shadow perfectly bisecting the model of the Earth. "The eclipse of Thales!" Julian shouted, his voice booming in the quiet room. "The one Herodotus wrote about, the battle between the Lydians and the Medes. They stopped fighting because the day turned to night, exactly as Thales predicted." He turned to Elara, his face alight with pure, unadulterated joy. "It works! Elara, it works! It's perfect! It's not just a calendar, it's a computer, a clockwork cosmos from the mind of Archimedes himself." Elara looked from the flawless simulation to Julian's ecstatic face, and for the first time all night, she allowed herself a small, deeply satisfied smile. Their 6 years of work, the endless grant proposals, the political fights with the Antiquities Board, it had all been worth it. They had done it. They had proven, beyond any shadow of a doubt, the sheer, earth-shattering genius of the ancient Greeks. Their thesis was confirmed. The story was complete. The euphoria of discovery has a notoriously short half-life. A week after their breakthrough, the celebratory champagne bottle sat empty on a bookshelf, gathering dust. The lab, once a pristine temple of science, now looked like a besieged outpost. A scattering of coffee cups, crumpled notes, and takeout containers littered every available surface. The holographic model of the Antikythera Mechanism still floated in the center of the room, but its silent, perfect dance now seemed less wondrous and more mocking. Elara sat before the main console, her face bathed in its cold light. The initial high had given way to the long, laborious grind of verification. For days, she had been running the simulation forward from its 128 BC origin point, meticulously mapping every predicted eclipse, every planetary alignment, against the vast established canon of astronomical history. It was painstaking, tedious work, but it was necessary. Science, after all, is not about the one spectacular success. It is about the thousands of repeatable results. And that S, where the problem started. Her brow was furrowed in a deep, familiar knot of concentration. The simulation was predicting a total solar eclipse over the city of Alexandria on the vernal equinox of 102 BC. It was a clear, unambiguous prediction. The shadow path was precise, the timing exact. She had first checked the NASA database. Nothing. Then the French Institut de Mécanique Céleste et de Calcul des Éphémérides. Nothing. She even cross-referenced it with Babylonian clay tablets known for their obsessive celestial record-keeping. There was no record of any such eclipse. It simply never happened. Calibration drift, she muttered to the empty room, the words a familiar mantra for any experimental scientist. An error. It had to be an error. A phantom value in the AIS reconstruction. A miscalculation in the gearware algorithm. A ghost in the machine. She pushed away from the console and began running a full diagnostic, confident that she could isolate the flawed line of code and excise it like a tumor. Across the lab, Julian S.'s cheerful face filled a large wall-mounted screen. He was on a video call with Dr. Marcus Thorne, the immaculately dressed and unnervingly slick head of the Hellenic Antiquities Board. Thorne's smile was a masterpiece of political engineering, conveying warmth and authority in equal, disquieting measure. And so, Marcus, the initial data is not just promising, it's revolutionary, Julian was saying, his voice resonating with academic passion. We'll have the first draft of the paper for you within the month. It will fundamentally rewrite our understanding of Hellenistic technology. Thorne's smile didn't waver. Excellent news, Julian. The Minister of Culture is taking a personal interest. The narrative is, of course, paramount. Greek genius rediscovered. A testament to our national heritage. See that the paper reflects that. No ambiguities. The last word was spoken softly, but it landed with the weight of a stone. The days that followed blurred into one long, frustrating night for Elara. She worked alone, long after Julian and the rest of the university staff had gone home. Her world shrank to the holographic gears and the endless rivers of code scrolling across her monitor. She was a surgeon, hunting for a single rogue cell, but the patient was fighting her. She isolated the routines responsible for the 102 BC error. She rewrote the algorithm, adjusted the gear ratios, and ran the simulation again. The phantom eclipse vanished. For a moment, she felt a surge of triumph. Then she saw it. Further down the timeline, in 74 AD, the model now showed a lunar cycle that was off by a full 3 degrees, a vastly more significant error, like a clock suddenly losing an hour. She cursed, diving back into the code. She fixed the lunar deviation, only to find the orbits of Jupiter and Saturn now predicted a conjunction that was physically impossible, a celestial fender bender that would violate the laws of gravity. It was a nightmare, a game of digital whack-a-mole. Every time she hammered down one error, 2 more, larger and more monstrous, would pop up somewhere else. Her methodical process, the logical, step-by-step approach that had served her entire life, was failing. Her frustration curdled into a cold anger. The machine, this flawless, perfect ghost of a machine, was actively resisting a rational explanation. After one particularly maddening 4-hour session that resulted in Mercury flying out of its orbit entirely, she slammed her fist down on the steel desk, the sharp crack echoing in the silent, cavernous room. The next afternoon, she stood in the doorway of Julian S.'s office, feeling like a general reporting a rout. The contrast to the lab was jarring. Julian S.'s office was a warm, cluttered cave of knowledge. Books were stacked in precarious towers, ancient maps were tacked to the walls, and small priceless artifacts sat on every surface. It was the den of a man who believed history was a story to be told, not just a data set to be analyzed. She explained the cascading failures, her voice clipped and professional, betraying none of the raw frustration she felt. Julian listened patiently, leaning back in his creaking leather chair. He wasn't looking at her, but at a printout on his desk, a star chart of the phantom eclipse path over Alexandria. When she finished, he didn't look concerned. He looked fascinated. "A lunar cycle off by 3 degrees, you say?" he mused, tapping a pen against his chin. "And the more you try to fix it, the worse it gets." "It's a systemic corruption in the AI model," Elara stated flatly. "I may have to wipe it and restart the reconstruction from scratch. Another 6 months of work." Julian picked up the printout. "Or," he said slowly, a glint in his eye, "what if it's not an error? What if it's a feature?" Elara stared at him, incredulous. "A feature? Julian, it's predicting events that never happened. It's generating nonsense. That's the literal definition of being wrong." "Is it?" he countered, standing up and walking to a large map of the ancient world. "It is consistently wrong. It's systematically wrong. That's not nonsense, Elara. That's a pattern. What if the machine isn't broken? What if we're just not asking it the right questions?" He turned back to her, his expression animated. "I think we should stop looking at the astronomy for a moment and start looking at the mythology of the era, the stories, the things people believed they saw in the sky." Elara couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Mythology? You want us to analyze this device based on folklore, on superstition?" The word dripped with disdain. "We are scientists, Julian. We deal with evidence, with facts, not with stories." This was it, the fundamental line between them, drawn sharp and clear. For Elara, the problem was a technical glitch demanding a technical solution. For Julian, it was a mystery that required a leap of imagination. Their first real disagreement hung in the air, heavy and unresolved. The machine was no longer a symbol of their shared triumph, but the beginning of a conflict that threatened to tear their partnership and their understanding of the world apart. A wall of silence stood between them. For 2 days after their argument, Elara remained in her sterile, brightly lit lab, wrestling with a machine that had turned from a marvel into a tormentor. Julian, meanwhile, retreated into his own world, a world of dust and whispers, of ink and clay. He took refuge in the university library's rare books section, an archive so deep within the campus foundations that it felt like a tomb. Here, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and forgotten knowledge. He had abandoned the official histories. He knew, with a certainty that was more instinct than intellect, that the answer to the mechanism's paradox would not be found in the clean, well-lit corridors of established science. He was hunting for something else. He pored over fragile Egyptian papyri, whose hieroglyphs were faded to pale ghosts. He ran his fingers over the sharp, wedge-shaped impressions in Babylonian clay tablets, records from a civilization that had stared at the heavens with obsessive patience. He wasn't looking for astronomical data. He was looking for the anomalies, the footnotes, the myths that astronomers and historians had dismissed as poetic fancy or primitive fear. He began to find it. A recurring symbol, a small, peculiar cuneiform mark, appearing in texts separated by hundreds of years and thousands of miles. In a Hittite inscription, it was called Kaskel-Kur, the star that wanders from its path. In a Ptolemaic Egyptian text, it was simply Sa-Enanch, the star of the other. It was always depicted as a bringer of chaos, an unwelcome visitor in the orderly clockwork of the heavens. An elderly librarian, a woman with fingers as thin and dry as papyrus herself, helped him with a particularly damaged fragment. It was a pre-Hellenic text, barely legible. "It speaks of a cast shet, a sky-cleaving shadow," she translated, her voice a dry rustle. "It says it devoured the sun and silenced the birds." She pointed to a series of markings. "On a date that, well, it seems meaningless. It doesn't correspond to any known calendar of the period. Julian photographed the fragment with his tablet, his heart beginning to beat a little faster. He was no longer just a historian analyzing the past. He was a detective following a cold trail, becoming a believer in a new kind of data. That night, Julian burst into the lab like a man possessed. Elara didn't look up. She sat slumped in her chair, staring blankly at the holographic display, which was now frozen on a corrupted star map, a mess of nonsensical overlapping orbits. She looked utterly defeated. "It's no good," she said, her voice hollow. "I'm wiping the core matrix. We have to start over. 6 months of our lives gone." "Don't touch it," Julian commanded, his voice so sharp and full of energy that Elara actually flinched. He strode to her console, holding up his tablet. The screen showed a dozen different images of the strange cuneiform symbol. "Elara, you've been trying to fix the machine, but it isn't broken. You've been trying to force it to speak our language, but it's been speaking its own all along." He pulled up the image of the papyrus fragment next to a screenshot of the phantom Alexandria eclipse. "The machine isn't tracking our solar system exclusively. It's built to track this." He tapped the cuneiform symbol. "The wandering star. The star of the other." Elara looked at him with weary disdain. "Julian, I'm not in the mood for conspiracies. We have a real technical problem here. Listen to me," he insisted, his voice dropping with intensity. "The librarian, she translated a line for me. A sky-cleaving shadow that devoured the sun. Sound familiar?" She said the date was meaningless. He pointed from the fragment to the eclipse data on her screen. "But it's not meaningless, Elara. The date on that fragment from a pre-Hellenic myth is March 20th, 102 BC. It's the exact same day the machine says there was a total solar eclipse over Alexandria. The silence in the room was absolute. Elara stared, her mind racing, connecting the dots against her will. A myth, a ghost in the machine, a perfect match. The two methodologies, her science and his history, collided in that single, impossible data point. She finally found her voice, a shield of pure, undiluted skepticism. "Let me get this straight. You want me to recalibrate a billion-dollar astronavigation model, a monument of scientific inquiry based on a bedtime story?" The antithesis, the world of myth, was being presented to her as a testable hypothesis. "Yes," Julian said, his eyes blazing. "That's exactly what I want. Prove me wrong." Elara stared at him for a long moment, then at the corrupted model, then back at Julian's insistent face. A cold, hard knot of anger and curiosity tightened in her stomach. She turned to the console, her fingers moving stiffly. "Fine," she snapped. "Fine. I'll run your ghost story. But when this is over, we are wiping the drive." She worked with a tense, angry precision. She created a new system variable, Object X, and began programming a new body into the solar system. Its orbital parameters were a mess, pieced together from the fragmentary descriptions in Julian's texts. A bizarre, long-period orbit, highly elliptical, tilted far off the ecliptic plane. It was an orbit no planet should have. She finished the input, her finger hovering over the execute button. "This is insane," she muttered, and pressed it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The corrupted model hung in the air, broken and chaotic. Then the entire hologram flickered. A deep, resonant hum, a sound that was felt more than heard, seemed to emanate from the image. The holographic gears, all 82 of them, shuddered violently and then began to move, realigning themselves with a deafening series of clicks that existed only in the simulation. Object X, the wandering star, appeared as a point of deep purple light, locking into its impossible orbit. And as it did, the rest of the cosmos snapped into place around it. The orbit of Mars, which had been off, corrected itself. The impossible conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn dissolved into a proper alignment. The lunar cycle, which had been off by 3 degrees, suddenly found its perfect, elegant rhythm. Stunned into silence, they watched as Elara ran the simulation forward. They arrived at March 20th, 102 BC. And there, on the screen, a total solar eclipse cast its shadow perfectly over the city of Alexandria. All the errors, all the frustrations, all the cascading failures, they were all gone. They hadn't been errors at all. They were consequences. The machine hadn't been broken. It had been perfect all along. It just wasn't for us. Julian stared at the corrected, impossible cosmos floating before him. His face a mask of dawning comprehension and sheer, soul-shaking awe. The image from the thumbnail made real. The foundation of his world had cracked, and through that crack, he was staring into an abyss of terrifying, exhilarating possibility. The awe and terror of their discovery hung in the lab for days, a silent, pulsing thing. The perfect, impossible clockwork of the alternate cosmos spun in the air between Elara and Julian, a testament to a truth neither of them was equipped to handle. The question was no longer, how does it work? The question was, what do we do now? Their first cautious step was to report to the man who held the purse strings and their careers in his hands. Dr. Marcus Thorne. They sat stiffly in a sterile conference room, the holographic display between them and a large screen where Thorne's face appeared, radiating a practiced, political warmth. They framed their findings with extreme care. They called it a hypothetical model, a theoretical framework that resolved the device's operational paradoxes. Julian did most of the talking, his voice carefully measured, stripping his discovery of all its terrifying wonder and presenting it as a dry academic puzzle. Elara remained mostly silent, her arms crossed tightly, a sentinel guarding the border of her own skepticism. Then they showed him the slide. The one with the wandering star, Object X, and its bizarre, tilted orbit. The warmth vanished from Thorne's face instantly, as if a switch had been flipped. His eyes became small and hard. Object X, he repeated, the words cold and sharp. What precisely is that supposed to be? It's the theoretical body that a number of pre-Hellenic myths seem to refer to, Julian began, but Thorne cut him off. Myths, Thorne said, his voice dripping with condescension. UV recalibrated the most important discovery in the history of Hellenistic science based on myths. He let out a short, sharp laugh devoid of all humor. Are you two engaging in pyramid power pseudo-science on my department's dime? Do you have any idea how you sound? Marcus, the data is undeniable, Elara interjected, her voice firm. Every anomaly in the mechanism is resolved when this object is factored in. It works. Perfectly. I don't care if it works, Thorne snarled. I care about the narrative. I care about the reputation of this university and this department. You will bury this nonsense. You will stick to the established, peer-reviewed facts. The final paper will be about Greek genius, and Greek genius alone. If I see one word about a wandering star or any other fantasy, not only will your funding be suspended indefinitely, but I will personally see to it that you are both publicly discredited. You will be a laughingstock. The screen went black. The call was over. Thorne's threat shattered their fragile alliance. The shared discovery that had briefly united them now drove them apart, each retreating into their own ideological corner. Elara, stung by the accusation of pseudoscience, fell back on the hard tenets of her own faith. Empiricism. She spent her days and nights desperately trying to find a rational explanation for Object X. She filled whiteboards with equations, cross-referencing every known catalogue of long-period comets and rogue asteroids. It had to be a known object, she reasoned. Something the ancients saw, recorded imperfectly, and wrapped in myth. She was back in her comfort zone, wrestling with hard data, trying to force the terrifying anomaly back into a box science could understand. Julian, however, went in the opposite direction. Rebuked by the scientific establishment, he fully embraced the fringe. He descended into the digital rabbit hole, spending his time on ancient astronaut forums, conspiracy blogs, and websites dedicated to catastrophism. He found dozens of other myths, from Mesoamerican legends to ancient Chinese chronicles, that all described a similar celestial visitor, a bringer of floods and fires, a star that didn't belong. He printed out star maps drawn by mystics and translations of texts that mainstream academia deemed forgeries. The lab became a battlefield of competing worldviews. Elara's side was covered in astronomical charts and physics textbooks. Julian's was littered with printouts of UFO sightings and analyses of Sumerian myths. The tension between them grew thick and acrid. "I think I've found it," Elara declared one evening, pointing to the orbital path of a comet known for its 1,000-year cycle. If its perihelion was slightly different 3,000 years ago, it could account for some of the observations. Julian looked at her work with pity. A comet, Elara. Was it a comet that taught them how to build a differential gear train? Comets don't have gears designed to track them. "It is a more plausible explanation than ancient aliens," she shot back, her voice rising. "We have to be rational about this." "Rational?" he scoffed. "Ignoring the evidence because it doesn't fit your worldview isn't rational, Elara. It's dogmatic." The final blow came a week later in a cold official email. Citing a lack of publishable progress and a departure from the project's original thesis, the university had suspended all funding for the Antikythera project, effective immediately. That night, Elara was in her small, neat apartment, packing her life's work into cardboard boxes. Her books, her research papers, her awards. Each one felt like a stone. There was a knock on the door. It was Julian, his face grim, a laptop tucked under his arm. "He did it then," she said, not needing to ask. "Thorne actually did it." "He did," Julian said quietly. "But I found one last thing, something you need to see." He opened his laptop on her coffee table. The familiar, impossible cosmos of the mechanism spun on the screen. "I made a mistake," Julian said. "I was so focused on the past, on where it came from. I never thought to ask where it's going." He typed a command. The simulation raced forward, past their own time, into the near future. "The machine doesn't just track the past, Elara. It predicts the future." On the screen, the purple light of the wandering star continued along its vast elliptical path. It was on a return trajectory. The simulation showed a future date, only 4 years from now, when its orbit would once again bring it sweeping through the inner solar system, passing terrifyingly close to Earth. "My God," Elara whispered, sinking onto the sofa. "It gets worse," Julian said, his voice barely audible. He pointed to the rearmost dial of the holographic machine. For the date of the star's future return, the mechanism wasn't predicting an eclipse or an alignment. The dial, the one scholars had always assumed was for tracking agricultural cycles or Olympic Games, had calculated something else entirely. It was filled with a sequence of complex, non-astronomical symbols, symbols she had never seen before. It wasn't a calculation. It was a message, or a set of instructions. The academic mystery was over. The historical puzzle was solved. Staring at them from the screen was something else entirely. A present-day threat, a future warning. The revelation of a future threat obliterated all their previous arguments. The academic rivalry, the methodological disputes, it all evaporated in the cold light of the laptop screen. The symbols pulsed with an urgency that left no room for anything but a singular, shared focus. They were a team again, united not by a discovery, but by a warning. They returned to the lab, their lab, sneaking past security in the dead of night. The funding was gone, their keycards were deactivated, but Julian, with a historian's appreciation for institutional weaknesses, still had a physical key to a service door that hadn't been recalled in 50 years. Inside, they brought the machine back to life, its impossible cosmos once again spinning in the silent, cavernous room. They focused on the final dial, the one that held the message from the future. "They're not astronomical," Elara said, her voice a low hum of concentration as she magnified the symbols. "They're not letters, not any alphabet I've ever seen. They look topographical." Julian leaned closer, his eyes tracing the intricate lines. "She's right," he breathed. "Look at the flow, the contours. It's not writing, it's a map. It has the same symbolic language as ancient Portolan charts, the ones sailors used before modern cartography. This was the synthesis they had been unknowingly working towards their entire careers. Julian's knowledge of ancient symbology and forgotten ways of seeing the world, combined with Elara's mastery of modern data-driven science. He saw the what. She provided the how. Julian identified the patterns and the logic of the ancient cartographer. Elara then translated his insights into commands for the lab's AI. She instructed it to treat the symbol sequence not as a language to be translated, but as a vector data set to be plotted. But a map of what? Julian wondered aloud. There are no coastlines. Maybe the coastlines aren't the important part, Elara countered, her fingers flying across the console. She instructed the AI to disregard landmasses and overlay the vector plot onto a global seafloor topography map. For a moment, the symbols were a meaningless scribble across the deep blues of the world's oceans. Then the AI began its work. It shifted the plot, rotated it, scaled it, searching for a correlation. And suddenly, with a soft chime of confirmation, the symbols locked into place. They resolved into a sharp, clear arrow, pointing directly to a single, specific spot in the Aegean Sea. At the tip of the arrow, a set of precise coordinates glowed in golden light. Elara stared at the numbers, her face draining of all color. The coordinates were not just a point on a map. She knew them. A cold dread, a feeling of impossible recognition, washed over her. "No," she whispered. "It can't be." She scrambled to her personal server, her hands shaking as she typed in her old credentials. She pulled up a research file from her doctorate, a deep-sea survey from 15 years ago. A younger, more certain Elara had been mapping a section of the Aegean, looking for new volcanic vents. And there, on a sonar reading from the expedition, was a massive, unexplained magnetic anomaly, a distortion so powerful it had fried 2 of their underwater sensors. She had dismissed it at the time as an equipment malfunction, a data ghost caused by a solar flare. It was the only rational explanation. She projected the old sonar map next to the mechanism's output. The location of her equipment malfunction and the coordinates from the 2,000-year-old machine were identical, down to the meter. "The Attican Trench," she said, her voice hollow. "It's one of the deepest, most unexplored parts of the Aegean. We always thought it was volcanically inactive." She looked from her old, discarded data to the message from the future. The machine wasn't just telling them where the wandering star was going. It was telling them where it had come from, or where its creators had landed. Her own rigid adherence to the scientific method, her refusal to accept a reality that didn't fit the data she expected, had caused her to overlook the most important discovery of her life. The truth hadn't been waiting in the stars. It had been waiting in her own archived files, dismissed and forgotten. Months later, the salt spray of the Aegean Sea hit Elara's face. The sun was warm, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. The world felt utterly normal, a stark contrast to the reality she now carried. She stood on the deck of the Wanderer, a sleek, modern research vessel, its twin hulls cutting cleanly through the waves. The university had disavowed them. Dr. Thorne had made them pariahs in the academic world. But their data package, the full, unredacted simulation, the historical analysis, and her own 15-year-old sonar logs had been undeniable. They had taken it to a private benefactor, a reclusive tech billionaire with an appetite for disruptive truths and a disdain for institutional gatekeepers. They didn't get a press conference or a Nobel Prize. They got a ship. Julian stood beside her, his face weathered by the sun, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He looked more at peace than she had ever seen him. The search for knowledge had led him out of the dusty archives and into the wide open world. "Ready?" he asked quietly. Elara looked down at the deep, dark blue of the water, an abyss that held a secret 2 millennia old. She thought of the certainty she had lost, and the terrifying, boundless uncertainty she had gained. Was she ready? Ready to face whatever was waiting for them in the crushing darkness of the Attican trench? Ready to find the source of the machine, to prove a truth that could shatter human history? "No," she said, her voice clear and steady above the rush of the wind. "But we're going anyway." She turned from the water to face the horizon, a new kind of explorer, forged in the crucible where science and myth had finally merged. The camera pulled back, showing the small ship, a tiny speck of human endeavor, alone on the vast, glittering sea, heading steadfastly towards a point on the map where an impossible truth was waiting to be woken. What a fascinating story. On the surface, it is a classic sci-fi mystery about an impossible artifact. But what really sticks with me is the human element to the battle between two different ways of knowing. At the beginning, it is easy to be on Dr. Vance's side. She's the voice of reason, demanding hard data and testable facts. Dr. Croft, with his talk of myths and poetry, seems like a romantic getting in the way of real science. We are trained to think this way, trust the numbers, dismiss the folklore. But the story brilliantly turns this on its head. The mechanism isn't just a machine, it's a story. And its errors aren't glitches. They're chapters of that story written in a language science had forgotten how to read. It took Julian's willingness to listen to the superstition, the ancient myths of a wandering star, to find the key. This isn't really a story about science being wrong. It's about how science, when it becomes too rigid, can be blind. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important clue isn't in the clean data, but in the anomaly, the outlier, the bedtime story that gets dismissed. It makes you think about how we approach the unknown. When faced with a mystery you can't explain, is your first instinct to trust the data you have, or to look for the story the data might be telling?